welcome everybody to another monthly Murmuration. My name is Erin Postumus. I'm the Partnerships and Projects Coordinator here at the USA National Phenology Network. If this is your first time joining us, we are really glad that you're here. These are monthly calls that we're offering to both Nature's Notebook observers and leaders of local phenology programs. And we're calling them our monthly Murmurations. They are different topics each month. We try to vary the times of these to allow a lot of people with different schedules to attend. This month, we're really fortunate that we're going to be diving into some recent research. That's one of our top requested topics is how are my Nature's Notebook data being used? So we're going to hear about one example of that from our director, Dr. Theresa Crimmins today. So I'm going to turn it over to Theresa. And then we'll make sure we have time for questions at the end. There is a Q&A, but feel free to put stuff in the chat and we can keep this pretty informal too. So maybe at the end, if you want to unmute and ask questions, we can leave time for that as well.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks to all of you for being here. This can be informal. I really am happy if you have questions, if you want to just, pop in, either raise your hand or put them in the chat or just shout them out. Because it's a small group of us, and the intention really here is to help support your understanding, broader understanding of what this is all about. What I'm going to be doing my best to explain here today is how we predict, how we use the phenology observations that you contribute to then be able to predict when particular events might occur. And so it is a kind of a technical topic because there is math involved there, but I'm going to try to explain it as best as I can without doing too much math. So what I'm specifically going to be speaking about is how we generated a couple more what we are calling spring development indices. And so maybe before I start, I just want to try to gauge your familiarity with the indices that we have had in place for the last couple of years. So maybe it's the best way for people to just raise your hand if you have heard us talk about the spring index or the spring indices or the leaf index or the bloom index, and you have some idea of what that is. Go ahead, if that sounds at all familiar, go ahead and raise your hand. And if you do not know what spring index is, or any of those words that I just said, then keep your hand down and that will be helpful to me. Okay, cool. I see a couple hands. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So that's good. I want to be able to, you can put your hand back down because then you can raise it again when you have questions. So I will do my best to explain kind of more in a generic way what phenology models are and how they come into being, and then also what those existing spring indices are and what the new ones that are coming online are going to look like, what they entail. Okay, so being able to predict when stuff is going to happen in plants and animals is actually really useful. And you've probably heard Erin and others talk about this a fair bit. This is one of the ways in which the data, the observations that you contribute are useful to both folks in a local context and much more broadly. And so some of the examples, the most concrete examples that I can think of where it's helpful to know when something is going to happen is in management, immediate and short-term management and planning kind of contexts. So we have a lot of examples from the agricultural world where it's really, if you plant at a certain time, you typically know when you put the seeds in the ground or when you put the seedlings in the ground, you are able to then anticipate when the crop is likely to come to be ripe and come to fruition and require harvest. And so folks that manage crops on a large scale have pretty dialed in predictive models that enable them to be able to lock in the date of planting and then keep track of what the conditions are in the intervening time that can then help them understand I'm going to need to put, get my combines out on this field and during this week and probably over here during this week because the crops will come to, will ripen at those particular dates. Invasive species and pest management is another really concrete example. And I'm just going to walk you through one example. So there are these insects called scale insects that can actually do all sorts of damage. There's lots of different kinds of scale insects. This particular example that I'm giving is the pine needle scale. And it's actually native. It's not an invasive, it's not been introduced. It's like part of our northern east ecosystems, but it can, when it gets out, when the population sizes get out of control, it can really be devastating. It can both kill whole like branches of pine trees and whole trees if the infestation gets bad enough. And so a lot of times folks in either landscape spaces or horticultural or even forestry management wish to try to control the populations of these insects to reduce damage. They, just like many insects, they undergo different life cycle stages. They start out as crawlers, which is what these little orange dots are on these pine needles. And then they undergo several different, I don't think instar is the right word, several different stages. And they eventually become these larger, I forget what these are called, bigger ones that have kind of this hard shell, and I forget what this is called too. I'm gonna have to send you an email that follows up with all the terminology. But at this point, when they have the big white hard coating on them, they are any sort of pesticide is ineffective at treating them. When they're the little crawlers, their bodies are soft. They've just hatched from eggs and they're crawling around and they're trying to get their mouth parts wedged into the needles to suck the juices. Those guys actually can be treated with herbicide, or sorry, pesticide effectively because their bodies are soft and pervious. But then as they age and they undergo those different stages, they become progressively, it's a scale. They develop this what's called a scale, and that's why they're called a scale insect, and they are impervious. So the trick is that you really want to know when the crawlers are hatching and the cohort is young, because that's when your treatment is going to be most effective. If you wait too late, if you wait too long, you're just wasting chemicals and putting more chemicals into the environment with no actual net benefit. We happen to know, because folks have kept track of pine needle scales and how they emerge and the rate at which they undergo those different life cycle stages, that the crawlers emerge around at a particular, after a particular amount of warmth has been reached. And so we can take that information and produce real-time maps like this one. And maybe you've seen maps like this on our website, but if not, this is a good opportunity to share with you. We have what we call pheno forecasts available for, I think, close to 20 now species and life cycle events. And this particular map, what it does is it lets you know in real time which locations in the country should, if you are trying to control for pine needle scale, is now the time where you should be out and spreading your chemicals, or is it too soon, or is it too late? And so what we do is take a predictive model, which I'm going to explain in a second, and we put this into production and compare it to recent temperature data and information, and are able to specify the locations where conditions are right. And so this map is actually about a week old. It was pulled from actually like 2 weeks old. June 5th, we have had some hiccups with some of our infrastructure recently, so some products are a little laggy right now, but they're going to be back online shortly. But as of June 5th, every location on the map that's yellow indicates a location where those crawlers are emerging, and that is a location where, yes, if you want to be controlling, now is a good time to be getting your chemicals out and trying to impact those critters. If you are in a location that's brown or this gray color, you're past. You've missed the window. Sorry, no luck. Try again next year. And if you're in a region where it's yellow, or sorry, like green or even blue or purple, then you haven't yet reached the conditions associated with those crawler emergences. So keep watching. It hasn't gotten warm enough yet where you are. And these maps, when everything's functioning on our system properly, and most of the time it is, but right now it's a little hiccupy. But when it is, these maps update nightly and then can indicate where you are relative to that, whether you should be taking action or not. Okay, so what's behind those kinds of maps? If we know that we need to take action at a particular time, and we know that people can actually predict when that time will occur, how do we do that? So what is true is that in most species, when events occur, like leaf out or flowering or insects hatching from eggs or undergoing those different, oh my gosh, what are they called? Stages in stars, whatever, has a lot to do with the local conditions. And very much, especially in temperate systems, which is much of our country, temperature is most of the story, honestly, how warm it has been. But that's not the whole of it. Sometimes species also need to have a certain amount of exposure to a certain amount of chill in the winter before they will start paying attention to the warmth in the spring. Sometimes they won't pay attention to that warmth until the days have a particular amount of sunlight, meaning that, we've progressed out of winter where the days are short. It's one way that insects, animals, other animals, and plants can keep track of, where we are in the annual cycle is by looking at considering day length. And there are receptors, photoreceptors in a lot of these species that can do that. And then out here in Arizona, where Aaron and I are situated, precipitation actually is a pretty important cue or limiting factor as well. So it depends on the species, it depends on the location, it depends on the life cycle stage that you're considering, but it's usually one or more of these variables. We could talk another day about how there are actually also biotic limitations, like species keep track of other species that can influence when they do stuff too, but we're not going to go that complicated today. We're going to stay focused on the environmental, abiotic, non-living factors. Okay, so really, how do we determine these cues? To be honest, it has everything to do with keeping track of when stuff happens, taking observations. That is the most fundamental piece of information. Knowing when something happened, when and where something happened is critical. It's the first piece, the first place we start for being able to figure out what are the conditions that are associated with that event occurring. What we're honestly trying to do here is understand when something happens, and when I'm saying when something happens, I mean a phenological transition, like a plant goes from not having open flower buds to having open flowers. When does that happen? Or when does an insect hatch from eggs? When does that happen? We want to know when that happens, when and where, so that we can then also reconstruct what were the conditions, meaning like the temperature preceding, leading up to that event, because those are the two pieces of information that we can put together to then figure out what is it that that species needs to be exposed to in order to undergo that transition. So how do we actually figure this out? Well, observations, observations and understanding, either documenting at the same time those environmental conditions like temperature, or reconstructing it, because temperature especially is one of those variables that we have really good historical data on. There are a number, especially here in this country, but this is true globally. There are tons of data products that we can access that provide for us daily minimum and maximum temperatures at every day, continuous across the globe, actually stretching back well over 100 years. So we can take the observations that you contribute that help us identify when something happens, like the pine needle scale crawlers emerged, and then figure, even if you aren't tracking temperature, that's fine, because we can take your record and attach it to those historical temperature data products that we can pull from other sources. But what we usually need is more than one observation. We either need multiple observations of that event at a single location in many years, which is the kind of example that I'm illustrating here. Or another way that we can go about this is the same event logged at many different locations across, say, the country or an area in a year or two. And because of Nature's Notebook, we're blessed that we have both. We actually have, for most of the species on our list now, many observations coming in for the same events at many locations across the country, and progressively more and more at this over multiple years. So we are really blessed with a good, rich data pool here that enables us to use these in quantitative ways. Okay, here's where some of the math comes in. I'm gonna try and keep it simple, but to try to actually figure out, okay, how much, what we're really trying to say is, okay, when that pine needle scale crawler emerges from an egg, we know that it has to be warm enough. It has to be exposed to a particular amount of warmth. How can we figure that out? How do we know exactly how much warmth it is? Well, basically, again, we take those observations of when it happened and we match it up with what was the temperature leading up to when it happened. And so this is an idealized example. And after I made this plot, I just made this up. I realized the temperature, the temperature measures are really very high, but so ignore the fact that the numbers are unrealistic. But what I tried to plot out here is a situation where we had, let's say this was a single observer tracking the same event in 4 years in their yard. And in the year one, they observed this thing. Let's say we're talking about pine needle scale crawler emergence. They saw it on day 58 of the year, which when I say day of year, what that refers to is if we take the 365 or 366 days in a year, in a leap year, we have 366, and we just start numbering January 1st as day one and January 2nd as day two. You go all the way through the year, and then December 31st is either day 365 or 366. Then every day of the year has a sequential number. And so day 58 is about, what is that, like February 26th or something? Somewhere right in there, end of February. And then in year two, they saw this event happen a little bit later. They saw it happen in about day 63. And then we had another year where they logged it at about day 68, and another time where they logged it at about day 73. Let me turn something off really quick so we don't get that chiming. And then, so that's just when they saw stuff happen. So that's fine. That's the kind of data that you are contributing to us right now. Even if you're not aware, whenever you say, yes, I see such and such, if it's the first time that you say, yes, I see that such and such, then that is equivalent to this kind of information here, where we're like, when did you first see that event? So now this is where an analyst can say, all right, cool. We need to know, how warm was it when that thing was first reported? And pulling again from those external temperature information, we can compile that information pretty readily. And so the measure that I'm using here on the x-axis is just a simple measure of temperature. I said average seasonal temperature. And so a lot of times that'll look like, winter is considered December, January, February, and then spring is often March, April, May. And so let's just pretend we're talking about spring temperature. So we would pull, for each of those years, what was the average spring temperature at the location where you collected your data? And then that's what helps situate or position these points on the x-axis, on this axis. And so how I would read this is the year that they said we first saw the crawlers hatch on day 58, we also had an average spring temperature of 35 degrees. So again, I told you it was not very realistic. Maybe if we're in Fahrenheit, maybe, I don't know. It's either too low or really, really low or really high. Anyway, pretend like it was 35 degrees. That was the average temperature on that year. And then the year that the person first reported the event occurring on day 63, that average temperature was 40. And then the year that the person first observed it happening on day 68, we also had an average seasonal temperature of 40 degrees. And then we had this one other year where things happened really late, much later, and the temperature was much higher. So this is actually a very weird example where the event is occurring later and later in the year when the temperature is warmer. And I'm now realizing as I'm talking you through this, that this is the inverse of how it typically works in the real world. So sorry, you're my guinea pigs. This is the first time I'm working through this. But we can fit a line through those points, and then you can actually come up with an equation that would explain it. And so without having to talk you through this is the old high school math of y equals mx plus b, where the m is the slope of the line and blah, blah, blah. Basically, the take home here is that if we are able to fit a line through the points like this, then we have an equation that we can use in a predictive way. Meaning that if this were a real world example that actually made any sense, and if this was your location and this was your crawlers, this was your data, then next year, when you were keeping track of the temperature, if you experienced an average seasonal temperature that was 45 degrees, then you can pop over here and either look at this line of best fit and say, okay, 45 degrees means that the guys are going to happen about day 68. Or you could plug it into this equation and solve for day of year by plugging that temperature in as your X. And so I apologize that that was a little unrealistic, but that is functionally how really simple predictive models can work using just a single variable like temperature. We actually get a little more sophisticated than that. That is one way that folks that you can do it, and it totally works. The truth of the matter is, though, and we see this right here, weather is weird, and you can have situations where your event occurred on different days, but it looked like the temperature was the same. And that's because this is an average seasonal temperature. And if you're averaging over a whole month or even a whole season, you can have a lot of weirdness get kind of mushed down when you're averaging. And plants actually, they're a little more sensitive than just a very coarse measure like average seasonal temperature. You can do a better job at predicting if you pay attention and characterize temperature more in the way that plants and other organisms actually pay attention to it. And what we understand to be true is that they're paying attention on a daily and an even hourly kind of way, kind of scale. And so there is this concept referred to as growing degree days that is invoked quite a bit in both agriculture and insect pest management and other phenology, predictive phenology kind of applications, especially again in temperate systems and boreal systems where temperature is the most important variable for predicting when things occur. So how this works, I'm going to walk you through this, and if you don't remember all the details, it's okay, but I wanted to kind of try to take a stab at explaining it because it's a concept that you can actually encounter quite a bit, even on like the backs of seed packets. They will give you growing zones, which is a very coarse way of helping you understand what you can plant and where, and whether the plants will come to maturity in time before it gets cold again. But they might refer to growing degree days too. And if you look at gardening blogs, a lot of times they talk about this too. So I'm going to try to talk you through it. So basically how this works is that if we think about a 24-hour period, generally what happens at a location is the temperature starts low early in the morning and then gradually increases as the sun comes up. Our peak in insolation and temperature is around late afternoon, 4 or 5 p.m., and then starts dropping down. Okay, that's cool. So if you were to just take the temperature for the day, a lot of times one measure that people will use is just average daily temperature. And basically the average daily temperature is going to be smack there in the middle. It's between the low point, the daily low temperature and the daily high temperature. But again, we can get a little savvier because organisms pay attention to things in a little bit different of a way. So what we know to be true is that in a lot of cases, organisms won't pay attention to any temperature, any warmth that they're receiving if it's below a lower threshold. And that lower threshold is biologically indicated, and we as scientists kind of guess at what it is. It's effectively the temperature below which the organism will remain dormant or in diapause or whatever word you want to use, because it varies by taxonomic group, but it just like ignores it and stays asleep. Once your temperature starts to bump above that, then we do pay attention to it. And so it's the part of the daily curve that happens to occur above that lower threshold. And then once you get much later in the season, it starts getting hot. A lot of species actually have an upper threshold too, where like it is right here in Arizona right now, it gets so warm that the plants or animals shut down again and they won't pay attention. They're just like, oh, I just can't. So that's why this upper threshold is represented here. But in most cases, especially like what I'm talking about here, in the spring season and temperate environments where you're coming out of a cold winter with a lot of freezing events, it's the lower threshold that matters. And so in this one day, in this idealized model, this is the part of that temperature curve that actually mattered to the plants. And so this is the area under this curve represents how many degree days or units, thermal units were accumulated on that day. And I'll walk you through that in just a second. So basically, at a location and in a year, we have varying temperatures. Think about your spring at your location. And once you start getting out of the really cold dead of winter, it starts getting warm and it's like herky-jerky, right? You can have one day that's really warm, like maybe 60 degrees. And then the next day, the high is like 35. And then it's back to like 40. And then back in maybe 45 and then 50. And then back low again. The plants and the animals are paying attention to that though. And they're basically keeping track of how much of that daily temperature curve was above whatever their base threshold is in each year. And so in this case, we're using, this is in Fahrenheit, 50 Fahrenheit is oftentimes is a frequently used base temperature, where if your average daily temperature is not above 50 degrees, then that organism will just remain dormant. 32 Fahrenheit or freezing is another commonly used threshold. 32 is actually more common for species that are active earlier in the season. And that's because, it's still cold. When we're just coming out of winter, it's still cold. And so for those ones that want to get up and going and put their leaves on, among the earliest, they actually start to pay attention as soon as the temperatures start to inch above freezing. They're like, okay, I'll count this. Others, especially like oaks and things that put on their leaves later in the season, they're like hanging out, waiting. They're like, we don't want to mess around with potential risk of frost. We're just going to hang out here, put on our leaves and our fruits much later in the season. Oftentimes, they don't pay attention to anything up that's not above 50 Fahrenheit. Anyway, from one day to the next, we have this variation in temperature. This red line is supposed to be indicating from one day to the next over 24-hour periods what that temperature, that ambient air temperature is. And so how growing degree days work then is that there's a really simple calculation that you invoke to figure out what is that area under that curve, meaning how many thermal units did you accumulate on that particular day? And in this day, I estimated that it was about 30 based on the y-axis here. And if this is the first day that we achieved any growing degree days at all in that year, then our running total is just 30. Then we pop to the next day and we had more warmth. That curve is bigger. Sorry, ignore the fact that we're above the upper threshold here because that's not helpful. But I estimated, okay, we achieved 45 growing degree days in this day. And so from an organism's perspective, we've now been exposed to a total of 75 growing degree day units because we had 30 from yesterday and then another 45 today. Okay, cool. The organism just kind of like takes that in, registers it, cool. Next day, we have a little bit colder conditions and we accumulated 32 growing degree days on that day. All right, well, when we sum 32 and what we've had so far this season, we're now up to 107. Okay, great. We might run into a cold spell where for a couple of days we don't achieve any growing degree days. And if that's the case, then this just sits where it's at. This total remains steady until we start achieving again. And then on this idealized day, I said, all right, we got 43 more. So then we add 43 to our running total of 107, and now we're up to 150. And so on and so forth. And we're just paying attention to how much warmth is being accumulated. We can then take this running total and plot this. And that's what this kind of curve looks like. So this is actually from our website. You can generate these using our visualization tools in real time. This is showing at a particular location, which happens to be my yard, how many growing degree days were accumulated on a from one day to the next in 2024. And so you'll see that we started out pretty low. Actually, I don't remember. No, sorry. This was Howell, Michigan. That's right. This is the town I grew up in. This is in the mitten of Michigan, Lower Mitten. I wanted to have something that looked more like a kind of a generalized curve like we see in the temperate systems. So basically what we see in 2024, and this is probably true for much of the eastern and northern US, we don't have any accumulation for all of January, a good chunk of February. We just start to achieve any accumulation where the temperature started to warm up ever so slightly in March and April. And it's really not till, gosh, mid-May that we finally start actually accumulating. And so this is where you see that the slope of the line starts to bend up. What that means is that the rate of accumulation of warmth is increasing, meaning we are now, we were adding only like maybe 10 growing degree days a day here, and now we're more like maybe 30, 40, 50 a day. And then we have pretty steady accumulation all the way through when we start experiencing autumn, when the days start getting shorter, temperatures start to cool down, and then that slowdown in that decrease in daily temperatures directly equates to we really slow down the accumulation of growing degree days until it just levels off, because once we hit November in Michigan, we are not accumulating any more growing degree days. We don't have any days above the minimum, the daily temperature is no longer above that minimum that I was working with, and here it's 50 degrees. So I'm sure that there were just no days in November and December last year where the average temperature was above 50. And so that's why there's no more growing degree days accumulated there. And so this sigmoidal curve shape is really pretty common because of basically the day length and the associated temperature. Okay, so, and then what's interesting too is we can plot a lot of different years for that variable at a location. I liked this plot. This is from a winery in Central California, and wineries pay tons of attention to this. They care so much about temperature because it has everything to do with not only pests that could damage either the leaves or the vines or the fruit, but everything, the accumulation of warmth and when it occurs and how rapidly it comes on or tapers off has a lot to do with what those sugars in the berries do. And so some of the folks that pay the closest attention to this information is vintners and folks that are growing those grapes. So what's cool about this plot, I think, is what this is it's the annual growing degree day accumulation curve at the same location in, what is that, like 13 different years, as well as the long-term average. The dashed black line is the long-term average there. And so you can look at that black dashed line as the long-term average, and then you can look at any one of those years and see how it departed from it. And you can really see how these two lines, 2010 and 11, were much cooler overall than some of the other years, and then some of them were much warmer. But that we see that same kind of shape of curve. Slower accumulation of warmth early in the growing season, and this starts on April 1st, actually. Speeds up in the middle of the year and then kind of levels off as we get to fall. This is November at the right side. So we just wanted to throw this in there too, in case you weren't aware. It is possible to take this kind of information where we're accumulating growing degree days at a single location and propagate it across the whole country. And then that's what these maps are that we offer. Again, they are updated on a daily basis. And these ones are active. This is as of yesterday, or 2 days ago. What this is showing is how many growing degree days have been accumulated at all the locations across the country as of today, or whatever day you want to set the map to. And in this case, I was looking at the 50 Fahrenheit base temperature. And so you can look at that and see which are the locations that have had the most warmth accumulated, which is not surprising, it's the southern states, which are the locations that have had the least amount of warmth accumulated so far, which is northern states and high elevations. And you can just kind of see that variation, and that's interesting. Okay, how this gets back though to using things in a predictive way is if you had figured out how many growing degree day units had to be achieved, or how many warmth units, growing degree days, an organism has to be exposed to in order to do its thing. And so going back again to the pine needle scale example, if we have figured out through observation and a little bit of math how many growing degree day units it takes for that organism to hatch from eggs and into crawlers, then we can watch that. We can basically predict when we think that event is going to occur, even if we haven't gotten there yet. And so this is another plot from our website. Again, I pulled this from our visualization tool again. This is a hypothetical example where some event was going to occur at 2,000 growing degree days. And the orange line depicts the long-term average. Okay, this one is from my house actually now in Tucson. You can tell because the numbers are really high. So that event, we typically, on average, long-term average, or no, this isn't long-term average. I'm sorry, this is 24 and 25. Okay, in 2024, we hit that at just about the beginning of June. The orange line is showing how that growing degree accumulation in last year. And then the blue line with the red forecast on it is this year. And what we can see is that the warmth accumulation has been ahead of schedule here in Tucson almost, well, basically since, what is that, about the end of March. It has been warmer here than it had been last year. And we hit that threshold a few days earlier this year than we did last. That's probably not super helpful. So let's walk through the example. Okay, so what I wanted to do is kind of contrast the way that we constructed the threshold before, how we came up with our model, our predictive model using average seasonal temperatures, and now pivot that to growing degree days. So again, this can be achieved in basically the same way. If we have observations being taken at the same location on the same event in different years, then we can look at what was that temperature accumulation curve at that location in those years and how many growing degree days were achieved. Oops, one of my things didn't show up. Okay, so I'm sorry, these slides needed a little bit more polish. So what I was trying to do was fill in those gaps. So for example, I don't know what happened with year one, but in year two, what we observed was that, sorry, this is year two, gosh. Okay, in year two, when that event occurred, we first saw the crawlers hatch. When we looked back at that growing degree day plot, we saw, okay, we have achieved 298 growing degree days here at this location today, and we first saw those crawlers emerge. Year three, we're watching for those crawlers again. We first see those crawlers emerge. We go look at the growing degree day accumulation plot, and we're like, hey, we've now had 320 growing degree days accumulate by the day that I first saw it. And then in year four, we're still watching. The first day we see them, we go look at the plot and we're like, hey, it's okay. 302 growing degree days have been achieved. And then we can just average that basically. And we can conclude that pine needle scale crawlers begin to emerge once the location has been exposed to about 300 growing degree days. And that's actually true. I made up this example, but the numbers here are actually real because other scientists came up with these. So they did it right. And so going back to the map that I showed you at the beginning, which is this pine needle scale forecast, again, our map is indicating the locations where we think that pine needle scale crawlers are starting to emerge and should be treated. If we go look at the legend on this map, I didn't really draw your attention to this before. The zones that are shaded yellow are locations that have received between 298, which is basically 300, and almost 450 growing degree days. So those are locations where organisms have been exposed to sufficient warmth but not so much that the insects have begun to move into their next life cycle stages. The locations on this map that are shaded brown are where it's been warm enough, there's been enough growing degree days accumulated, over 450, that we believe that we're past that crawler stage and we're now into the scale stages and even beyond. And once you get to the gray parts, you're way past crawlers. And the locations that are the greens, we're on the verge, we're on the cusp of having enough warmth, enough exposure to enough warmth that those crawlers will begin to emerge. Because we're in the 200, 250 growing degree day range. And if you're in the blue and purple, you got a ways to go. We really need for it to warm up before those crawlers will begin to emerge. Okay, maybe I'll pause there before I move on. Did that make sense? Or maybe more broadly, are there any questions or clarifications that I can make on growing degree days or growing degree day accumulations and how they're implemented?
We don't have any questions yet in the chat, but feel free to put your questions there or use the Q&A, or if you'd like to unmute, do that too. No
Okay,
questions yet.
I'll keep going. I'll keep going, but yeah, we can go back through this as needed. All right, so growing degree day thresholds, like I just showed, and how we have implemented in our website, in our products, in several instances, it is an accepted way of understanding warmth and how organisms respond to that warmth. There's limitations though, just like with everything. One of the limitations is that these thresholds are established for a single species for a single event. And so in this case, it is just crawler emergence in pine needle scale. We have some other maps that are things like, it's mostly insects, but there are growing degree day thresholds for many other things like flowering in Van Hout spirea. But it's always just a single event in a single species. There's an alternative, though, if you really want to kind of tell a more comprehensive story about what is happening, and that is to use an index. And so an index is a mathematical formula, that integrates across a number of different inputs. The best definition I could come up with for an index is that it's a composite measure, meaning that it's integrating among multiple things. The benefits is that it allows direct comparisons. So sometimes the inputs are measured on different units, and so you can't directly compare them. So if you kind of combine them, then you can make direct comparisons between what that index is doing now and what it was doing in the past. And the intention is to simplify the story. And so some good examples of indices that I could come up with that I thought maybe were fairly widely understood, at least to some extent, are the consumer price index, which is this measure that they talk about on the nightly news a lot. And it's this indicator, it's an economic indicator that's supposed to assess the cost of living. And it integrates they call it a whole basket of goods and services. It takes into account, all the things that we probably spend our money on, food, different kinds of food, food thingies that we buy, like milk and bread, and then there's medical costs, and then there's transportation in there, and a few other things. And then in total, it's supposed to give us a sense of like how expensive are things. And then once we have that single measure, we can plot it over time and we can look to see what's it doing. And I did not know this until I pulled this graph, but apparently the price index is lower, much lower now than it was a couple of years ago. So that was news to me. Another one that we hear about in the news a lot is the S&P 500 index, which is this measure, again, a composite measure that is supposed to tell us how the stock market is doing. And what it is that it's a composite of 500 leading companies on the stock exchange. And so instead of tracking all 500, because they're all doing their own independent things and nobody can think about 500 things at once, we mush them all together. And then that's like an aggregate measure of in total, how is the stock market doing? And it's supposed to give us an overall sense of, are we doing well? Are we in a bull market? Bull is good, bear is bad. And it's basically like which direction is this index trending over time? So it's bellwether. We can apply that same concept of indices to spring, and we have, and we do. We have a couple of spring indices that we generate maps for, and they basically are this integrated measure of when is spring starting and how is it progressing. And really, the best way that it is interpreted is at a local scale, is spring starting earlier or later? It's an index. We have two indices. We have the leaf index and the bloom index. They are indices because they are composites of three distinct species. And I can't remember, but I thought I put a slide in here, but I didn't. Okay, the three species that are the inputs to the leaf and the bloom index are cloned lilac and then two cloned honeysuckles. And there's more information on this on our website about this if you care. Basically, the reason why those species is because historical data at a large scale existed for them when the person who made the indices wanted to make them. So I don't know that it was a lot more well thought through than that. It was data availability. How it works is that there are two distinct indices. We first have the leaf index and then we have the bloom index. So lilacs and honeysuckles are species that undergo their leaf out and their flowering among the earliest in the season. And so the leaf index in particular is a indicator, we basically interpret it as a indication of the biological start of spring. Because when you have those species that are among the earliest starting to put on their leaves, and they are species that leaf out before they flower, then once those species are putting on their leaves, they're starting to initiate activity. That means we have hit enough warmth in the spring that spring has begun. And what's cool is that even though it's only lilacs and honeysuckles, those three species that are the inputs to this model actually is representative of activity in a lot of other species that begin activity early in the season, including some birds and some insects too. The leaf index, it sounds complicated to understand, but honestly, it works very similarly to a growing degree day threshold. It's basically once a certain amount of warmth has been accumulated at a location, you eventually reach that threshold, which I represent as a unitless line here, but there are units attached to it. Then you have achieved the spring index and spring has begun. That's basically what our maps indicate is the day of year that this line gets crossed. It's basically once your location has had enough warmth be accumulated on the day that you cross that line, then that is the day that the leaf index was reached. I'm not giving you a number because it's growing degree days. It's similar to growing degree days, but then there's also an accounting for these what are called synoptic capstone events. And so the model plants care more about multi-day warm periods in the spring, and especially as they get later into the spring. Plants in a straight up growing degree day accumulation model, if you have a warm spell in the early January, if you're just calculating a curve like this, you will count those units in the same way that you would count temperature units in the middle of April. It's just an accumulation. But from an organismal perspective, what we know to be true is that organisms kind of consider that warmth more seriously once the organisms know we're getting closer to when I should be doing my thing. And so the model kind of discounts those warm events that occur very early in the year and puts more emphasis on it later than the year. So hopefully that makes sense. That's why I'm not putting numbers on it. But it's still basically you've reached enough warmth that ding, you passed that threshold, the leaf index has been reached. And then what happens is your location gets filled in on the map that is moving usually northward. And then the bloom index is very simple. It's just more warmth after. After you've reached that leaf index, we just keep counting the temperature units and how much warmth and those big multi-day events that have occurred until bing, you cross that second threshold. That's the bloom index. And so we have two maps. They both at their core reflect the day of year that index was reached. And so these are the two companion maps from this year. This is the leaf index map and this is the bloom index map, and the colors are the same on both, and what they represent, it's kind of hard to see the scale, I'm sorry here, but the dark orange it starts with January 1st, and then May is these green tones. And so what these two maps here are showing us is what is the day of year that the conditions associated with the two indices were reached. So that's cool. That gives us a sense of when biological activity of different types occurred. And usually it's between 4 and 6 weeks apart that the leaf and the bloom index are reached at various locations. What really is interesting though is, again, so what? So was that date that we reached that measure earlier or later than usual? And so the maps that you probably have seen more frequently and definitely are more widely circulated in the news are these anomaly maps, which is where we take one of these, what's the day of year that, let's focus on the leaf index right now. What's the day of year that that index was reached this year? And how does that compare to when it's usually reached? And when we say usually, we're talking about a 30-year average. And the 30 years that we're comparing it to is 1991 to 2020. So the three most recent full decades. And that is what this is. That's what an anomaly map is. And so what we end up with is locations that we shade red, where this year the index was reached earlier than that long-term average, or locations that are blue, which are locations that reached the conditions associated with that index later than usual. And if it's white, it was like basically right on schedule. And so these maps are really interesting to look at. We've had some recent years where the whole eastern US is blood red. And those are the years when the media calls like crazy because they're like, what does this mean? What's going to happen? This year, not so much. We had really pretty comparatively late start of activity in the southern states. What happened then was that there was some large scale warm weather patterns that pushed things ahead of schedule. So what it means is that in these locations, they were exposed to sufficient warmth rapidly that pushed them to where they reached the index. They achieved the index earlier than average, but then we had really big cold periods, cold events that slowed everything back down again. And so then we had a bunch of locations that didn't get around to reaching that index till weeks later than average. And then finally it picked up and it got really warm again. And a whole lot of the US then was like, oh, no, we're hitting it ahead of schedule. And then it slowed back down again. So we've got a weird pattern going on this year for the leaf index. So that's, again, the first index that's reached. When we look at the bloom index, which again is reached 4 to 6 weeks later, typically than the leaf index, what we see is that a lot of locations hit it ahead of schedule. And that is really because of that later season warmer than typical temperatures that much of the nation was exposed to. And so I don't want to go into too deep of details. Interpreting these is a little tricky, but I have a couple of resources that can help kind of like bring it back down to a local scale story that you can tell with these, because I know looking at these two maps in tandem can be a little confusing. Okay, where are we going with this though? So the cool thing about these maps is that they allow us to tell a story about whether spring started earlier or late at your location. However, they only take us through kind of the middle of the spring season. We know that there's this whole continuum of time that constitutes spring, and all through that several month-long season, we have different species initiating activity in more or less a predictable sequence. We've got the lilacs and then the maples and then the birches, and then later on the redbuds are up there early, but then things, oaks and many other high canopy trees come on later, and it goes in that predictable sequence. But when those things actually happen still vary from year to year. And you can have some of the earliest season things come early, and then some of the later season things not necessarily also be early. That's what these maps are suggesting. But once we get past the bloom index, which really only captures kind of like the midpoint of spring, our ability, meaning the NPN's ability to tell you anything more about how things are going, we don't have anything else we can tell you. And so we wanted very much to be able to tell you kind of like, and what else? What's the rest of the story for spring? And so what we did is take all the observations for leaf out and flowering for deciduous shrubs and trees that we had for all of the species all across the country, brought them into a really big modeling context and tried to come up with distinct models for each species that predicted when they would leaf out or flower, similar to the growing degree day threshold, but a little more complicated. And then we aggregated them down into a series of indices, like we have with the spring leaf and bloom indices. And we came up with far more than are necessary. We created 8 more indices, meaning that in tandem with the existing leaf and bloom index, we would have 10. And our team decided that was too many. We don't need maps for 10 indices. We're only going to add 1 more, but I wanted to kind of just give you an indication of how things go. And so what we are looking at here, this is years across the x-axis, and then the y-axis is day of year. But what we did was for the whole of the lower 48 states, we figured out what was the average day of year that in the case of the black line, when was the spring index reached? And so this is a very coarse measure of whether spring started earlier or late for the whole lower 48 states from 1990 to present. And you can see that there are certain years that jump way out, like things were super early. 2012 was a really anomalous year. 2017 was another really anomalous year. But we've had a lot of variability from one year to the next. I put this on here and I put the little leaf there so you know that that's the leaf index. And then what we see is this solid gray line is the bloom index. And I wanted to show that because basically the takeaway is we have, again, interannual variability in when that index is reached. But the important piece is that it is a good 20 days behind the leaf index. So that's where you get that. It's like 3 to 5 weeks later. After you've achieved the leaf index at your location, then you'll hit the bloom index. Every one of these other lines is one of the new indices that we created. We are not implementing all of these in the future. It's just this very final pink dotted line, which we call the late bloom index, that is still yet to come online. We've been slowed down by some technical issues as of late, but we're so close. And I think in a couple weeks, we should have this stuff live. And so the intention with this additional index is that it's going to allow us to be able to tell you kind of how spring ended. It captures, it's a encapsulation of the species that are the latest to flower in the spring. And so it really captures the tail end of the starts of stuff in the spring season. This is maybe more detail than you need, but I wanted to be able to kind of tie this into, this is where your observations came in. Ignore the MAE and MBE stuff. That's like how well the model fits worked. What this is intended to show is all those different indices that we created, which we gave really great names of like really very early leaf and middle leaf and late leaf, are composed of individual species models. And these individual species models were created using all of the observations that you have been so diligently submitting. And so in all these cases, your data were used. And so these are all the species that are used in the new leaf indices, and these are all the ones that were used that compose the new bloom indices. And that late bloom index, that's the one that we are going to be implementing as another companion map to the existing maps that we have, is an average index that is composed of flowering and black cherry and common snowberry, which are 2 species that flower really late compared to everybody else. And so this is what we're going to have. You know, it's going to look just like this. It's going to look like a day of year map like we have on the right, and we're going to have an anomaly map like we see on the left, and it will go right along with its existing sister indices of the leaf and bloom index. That's a lot, and I'm happy to answer questions. I know I'm running out of time, but I'll hang on for as long as you want. But just in case you want to learn more about this, we did a publication summary recently on the work that we undertook to generate these new indices, and this is on our website, and we can stick this in the chat. And then also, there's been a couple of posts on climate.gov that I had a hand in preparing that help interpret the the existing leaf and bloom indices. And this is one of the second one in particular, this one that has the headline up right now that posted just a few days ago, is really good because it helps compare locations where the leaf index came early and the bloom index came late, or they both came early or they both came late, and it kind of helps depict why and what's going on there. So I recommend these, and I'll help get the links for those in the chat in a second. Okay, so that's what I had, and I am more than happy to try to do a better job explaining things that did not make sense there or hang on for other reasons. But thank you. Thank you so much for your time today and all the work that you put into what you do.
Thanks so much, Teresa. That was a really great, very comprehensive overview of how to understand growing degree days. I think everyone probably learned a lot about those. And I wonder if you could go back to your slide that showed the species that comprise those,
Yes,
the indices, because I asked if anyone wants to share, if you're tracking any of those, we'd love to have you kind of give a shout out in the chat, because your data were
absolutely.
included in those indices. We did have one question in the Q&A from Paula about the base temperatures that are used, and if you know if there's any variation in the base temperatures used for forbs. And I couldn't find any actual like thresholds for forbs. I was looking in that Dan Herb's publication, and none of them really, I think there might be some that may be considered forbs, mostly trees and shrubs, but all of those use a 50-degree. But do you know if there's any that use a different base temperature?
Well, okay, let me see what I can put my fingers on while I talk. Um, yes, I do not know off the top of my head of models for Forbes, though I don't want to say that they don't exist, and that's what I'm going to peek at real quick to see if I can. There's a website on this New Hampshire Department of Agriculture that has a bunch of thresholds, and Cornell has a bunch too, and they might list some for either one of them. But to answer the actual question of are other base temperatures used? Yes, definitely. Yes. And actually the models established in this model or in this body of work that we're talking about here, absolutely. Like what base temperatures of 30 or 50 are commonly used when folks are establishing those growing degree day thresholds by hand, kind of the way that I showed you, where you're taking the measurements yourself and kind of fitting a line. And that's completely viable. But there are more sophisticated ways, and we invoked a simulated annealing, which is like an optimization approach where we feed a bunch of data in and we say, computer, you figure out what's the best combination of start date, base temperature, and accumulation, and whether we need to pay attention to day length and latitude and what else did we look? I think we gave moisture. We allowed for moisture to be an influential variable. So it was more complex. And so long story short, when you go about that approach where you let a computer program solve for your variables, you absolutely can end up with base temperatures other than those too.
Great. And we do have people putting in the chat about what they're observing. So Sarah at Barking Slopes Phenology Project is tracking box elder and northern spice bush. We've got Susan tracking red maple and bur oak. And then Lisa tracking flowering dogwood, red maple, and forsythia. That's awesome.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I don't know if I can find that New Hampshire Department of Ag website super fast, but if not, I will be happy to share it out after the fact.
Yeah, we can include some links in the follow-up email where we send
Okay.
the recording around. Yeah. Yeah, any other questions that anyone has about anything that Teresa talked about? Once we have that late bloom index up on the website, we'll be sending around some emails about that too. So stay tuned. Last chance for questions. Let's see. Oh, and Tina said that she recently showed the leaf and bloom indices during a presentation. That's
Thank
awesome. Good
you.
job, Tina.
Yeah. Good on you. I know it's a lot. And so for the rest of you, if you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea, happy to answer further questions and we'll keep, I do think sharing links is a good idea because it does take a while to kind of wrap your head around it.
Well, thank you everybody for hanging in there with us a little bit past the hour. I think this was a really informative presentation. We'll definitely be sharing it around in newsletters too. So I think a lot of people would be interested in this to really get a background on how to understand these kind of models. So thanks so much for sharing the presentation, Teresa, and thanks everyone for joining us. We're hoping
Yes,
to have a couple more of these murmurations in coming months that will have some more networking opportunities. So definitely stay tuned for that. Yeah, thanks so much for being with us today.